woman comes up to her friend, sees her reading the Phenomenology of Spirit in German, Die Phenomenologie des Geistes, and says to her, I didn't know you knew German. Her friend goes, actually I don't, but I find it just as easy to not understand Hegel in German as I do in English. Okay, that joke is a little funny. I hope it's funny. Because Hegel is very hard to read, even if one knows German, and even if one has a very good translation of it. Fortunately, we live in a time where there are 5 very good translations of Hegel's Phenomenology. And I'm going to talk today about how to go about choosing which one to read when one embarks on reading Hegel for the first time or the nth time. It doesn't matter. I happen to have all 5 translations, including the German original, and I'll go through them one by one. So the Phenomenology, Die Phenomenologie des Geistes in German, it's hard to read in German. And there are certain English translations that make it a little easier. So much so that certain people that read and know German, maybe even that have German as their first language, will turn to the English to find a more accessible way to get into Hegel. That said, I think Hegel is one of those thinkers for whom knowing the original language does make a difference. So I don't think that you can't understand Hegel if you don't read German, but I do think there is a value added to learning German and reading Hegel in German, just because that's what I did. And I think that I gained some insight into his thought. If I hadn't done that, I wouldn't have had that insight. So let's go through the different translations. And after I introduce them and talk about the merits of each, I'd like to go pick out certain passages, I think important passages in Hegel, and look at how the different translators deal with them. So the first translation, this comes all the way back from 1910, when I bought the book, when it was hot off the press. I'm not quite that old. From 1910, you'll see that this is a translation called Phenomenology of Mind. There's the first problem with it. So the translator, J.B. Bailey, translates Geist, Phenomenology of Spirit. Geist means spirit. It also can mean mind in German, so there is some warrant for that translation. However, what you miss when Bailey translates Geist in mind is the fact that there's a whole section of the book where he's talking about something that's collective, and then Bailey does translate Geist as spirit, so he has to translate the same word by different English equivalents, which is, to me, an issue, a problem, because it makes it, if you translate a word consistently, even if your translation is suspect in some way, at least the reader can get their bearings relative to the translation, say, oh, that's the German word that's being used here. If you use multiple words to convey a word in the original, then it seems to me very hard as a reader to necessarily get a sense of that idea. Because you're right, wait, is that the same word? It's not? Okay, that can be obviously sometimes that can't be avoided. But there are certain times, and I think this is one of them, where one should avoid them. The other thing that's missed by the Bailey translation movement of Geist to mind is Hegel's debt to Christianity and der Heilige Geist, the Holy Spirit, totally lost in Phenomenology of Mind. But that said, the first translation I read as a young graduate student was the Bailey translation, and there's a nice poetry to it that I think few, maybe only one of the later translations really gets to. And I think there are some passages, I'll talk about one, that Bailey just does and captures better than anyone else. And maybe people should have just stuck with what Bailey said and not changed it. But there's the Geist to mind is a problem, the spirit to mind. And there are other infelicitous translations, so it was clearly worth redoing it. And the person to redo it in 1977, A.V. Miller, who translated other things by Hegel, including Hegel's Logic. So this is the Miller translation. And Miller's translation for 40 years was the one that everyone, it was the book of reference. And it's still widely available, and it's still pretty good. I think there are two deficits in it that stand out to me, and they're this. That Miller translates the idea that the German term Begriff, which means in English concept, which has a long tradition in philosophy, especially in Kant, just before Hegel, that Hegel's responding to. Miller translates that as capitalized notion. And what is that? I had a notion to go do something. No, it doesn't really capture it. A notion, and to capitalize it, to give it this mystical quality, and that I find pretty misleading in Miller, although there are other virtues of the Miller translation. The other second thing that I find really problematic is, I alluded to it with the term notion, he capitalizes various things haphazardly in the text. And I think this is a problem, and if you know German, you'll know why this is a problem. In German, every noun is capitalized. So one cannot know, oh, Hegel was going to capitalize that one for emphasis. No way to know that. So that's a deficit to me of the Miller translation, even though it's, in terms of readability, I think it's okay. I think it's a little less readable than the Bailey, but it's more accurate than the Bailey. So it's a movement in the direction of accuracy, away from readability. And again, both are good. There's not if you pick up either one of those, you're not lost. You're in good shape. Then the major breakthrough in 2018 in translating the Phenomenology comes from Terry Pinkard. And this is a version published by Cambridge. It's in a series of books. They all are in green. A series of books published by Cambridge by Hegel. So including this is The Science of Logic and some other, and the Encyclopedic Logic and some other minor writings. It's a very important series for people that read Hegel whose first language is English. And this is incredible work of translation of the Phenomenology by Pinkard. What Pinkard does is he breaks from both Bailey and Miller translating certain terms, and we'll get to some of these famous passages where he does that. But he's really he's the translator the most committed to capturing in English Hegel's exact structure and formulation in German. One thing that he retains from Miller, I think it's very valuable. So Miller numbers the paragraphs. Hegel does not number the paragraphs. In the German edition, they are not numbered. But this is one thing that Miller starts, and then Pinkard continues, and then we'll see that another subsequent translator, Michael Inwood, does this as well, but not the final translation that I'm going to talk about. So that's one thing that I think is valuable, just as a way to refer to certain parts, and you can do that across translations, at least across three of them, because they use this numbering system of the paragraphs. Hegel writes very long paragraphs. Pinkard retains his paragraphing, which will set it apart from other translations, although Miller does too. So that's one thing. They both retain Hegel's paragraphing and more or less his sentence structure. Pinkard really retains his sentence structure. He really wants to do that, and he retains his italics and his use of punctuation. So those are things that other translators are not as concerned with. Pinkard really wants to get that right, although at times he doesn't. There's little moments where you're like, well, is that exactly what Hegel is getting at? And maybe there could be an argument about that. But again, what Pinkard's striving for is to capture most accurately. He wants the accurate translation. The next one I'm going to talk about is by Michael Inwood. So Michael Inwood published his translation with Oxford, interestingly, the same year as Pinkard published his with Cambridge. So Oxford had published the Miller translation back 40 years ago, and then in 2018, it comes out with the Inwood translation. Inwood, like Pinkard, a very, very respected Hegel scholar. He's concerned with accuracy much more. I mean, Miller was trying to be accurate, but Inwood's translation is more accurate. Inwood, in a way that's different than Pinkard, however, I think is striving to make as much as possible an accessible and readable Hegel. Not that he's not trying to be accurate. He's trying to be accurate. But he thinks I think Inwood's idea is that the point is not capturing exactly how it is structured in German, but moving that structure into how that would be structured in English if Hegel were writing in English. So it's not to try to copy the German structure. And that makes for a more accessible text. And that's what he's striving for. The next translation, which appeared 1 year later in 2019 by Peter Fuss and John Dobbins, goes as far as it can in the direction of readability. And in doing that, Fuss and Dobbins are very open about the fact that they're going to break from the way Hegel structures paragraphs. They're going to cut up his paragraphs. They think Hegel uses italics too often. We're not going to do that. They think Hegel sometimes forgets to repeat a noun and he uses a pronoun. We're going to add the noun. So they're very, very liberal with Hegel's syntax and structure and even terminology. And this, you can see, like, maybe there's an advantage to that. And it might be that someone approaching Hegel for the first time would get a benefit from the Fuss and Dobbins take, because it really wants to gesture to how can I make this really open to a contemporary reader. So not trying to preserve Hegel's style of both of in another language and a style of yesteryear. People in the early 19th century tended to use italics more, write longer paragraphs, etc. That's gone. They're cutting that out. Let's look at a couple passages to clarify how the different translations deal with the same phenomenon. Okay, so the first one is this famous one that spirit, or the life of spirit, wins to its truth only by finding itself radically torn asunder, or only when it's radically torn asunder. So here's the Pinkard version. Spirit wins to its truth by finding its feet in absolute disruption. So that's okay. It's accurate word for word from German to an extent, but you can see there's something different about that. Here's Inwood. Spirit gains to its truth only when, in absolute disintegration, it finds itself. So the word that they're working with, absolute disruption, absolute disintegration, so absolute is the same word in German and English. And then Zerrissenheit is the German word. So Zerrissenheit means being torn asunder. So that's what they're trying to. Is absolute disruption the same as it being absolutely torn asunder? I don't know. Here's Fuss and Dobbins. Spirit wins to its truth only when it finds itself in virtual dismemberment. Okay, maybe. Here's Miller. It wins to its truth only when, in utter dismemberment, it finds itself. Okay, but you see the sense is a little bit changed. Here's Bailey. Here's my favorite, even though this is phenomenology of mind. There's all kinds of problems. But here's what Bailey says. It only wins to its truth when it finds itself utterly torn asunder. He's actually got it pretty good. Now let's go through a sentence, a couple lines down from this, very famous one about the tarrying with the negative. Here's what Pinkard says. This lingering is the magical power that converts it into being, that converts the negative into being. Here's what Inwood says. Dwelling on the negative is the magic force that converts it into being. Fuss and Dobbins. This capacity to abide with negation is a magical power that changes it into a form of being. That's, again, I don't know. Here's Miller. This tarrying with the negative is the magical power that converts it into being. That's pretty good. So Miller, we like on that one, I think. Here's Bailey. This dwelling beside it is the magical power that converts the negative into being. Okay, Bailey's pretty good on that. So what can we say about this little glimpse at the different translations of the preface to Phenomenology? I think the first thing we can say is that sometimes the oldest actually is the best. So the Bailey translation of the great line that spirit only wins to its truth when it finds itself utterly torn asunder, it seems to me, undoubtedly true. That's the best representation of the German term Zerrissenheit. And then if you look at the classic line about tarrying with the negative, it's only Miller, the translation from 1977, that uses the term tarrying to convey the German word verweilen. Verweilen, and I think obviously all these other words can work. So dwelling on the negative, lingering with the negative, abiding with the negative, all these different words can work just fine, except I think tarrying has this idea of an engagement with it that's certainly not there with lingering that Pinkard gives us. And I think this is, to me, this is the one of the points at which we see where Pinkard's concerned to try to really be as accurate as he can, doesn't capture the way that Hegel sometimes is really a poetic writer, and verweilen, tarrying. I think tarrying has that sense of poetry. I think abiding or dwelling are also, so Inwood follows Bailey and uses the translation of dwelling with the negative, and I like that. You're putting oneself in. But the danger of that is, and I think this is why the Miller tarrying with is better, is that the negative is actually what makes it impossible to dwell. So unfortunately, this early passage doesn't let us conclude, oh, this is the best translation. Although I think, again, there are merits to each one here. But I think if you were just going by this passage, you'd say, well, can we mix together Bailey and Miller, because they kind of get this passage maybe more about they get more of what Hegel's trying to do here than the later translations. Although I think that Inwood's absolute disintegration is a little bit better for the other line than absolute disruption. I think disruption doesn't go far enough. It's Pinkard's term. And then Fuss and Dobbin's virtual dismemberment. Virtual, there's no warrant to say virtual instead of absolute, because Hegel just uses the word absolute, which is the same in German as in English. And then they say dismemberment. And Zerrissenheit, I'm not sure. Dismemberment, I don't think really conveys it. It makes it into this bodily metaphor that I don't think is what Hegel was going for. This is why I think if you're not going to choose Bailey, which I think Bailey is obviously a translation from over 100 years ago, then I think Inwood gets us closest to what Hegel's trying to do in this section. Let's now move ahead to the section on self-consciousness and look at the different ways that the translators take up the terms master and servant, in German, Herr and Knecht. So this is obviously a dicey ground to be on. Pinkard, I think, is the best on this. So Pinkard translates them as master and servant. It's pretty straightforward. Interestingly, Bailey started this tradition, lord and bondsman, and then it means he calls the section mastery and bondage, which is strange. Although this is taken up by certain of the translators today, so it's nothing we don't get out of this. So this idea of master and bondsman is also the terms used by Miller in 1977, and then by Inwood in 2018. So it says the deficit of you're using the masculine, whereas servant is masculine, feminine, it's neuter. That's an advantage, I think, of using master and servant in the way that Pinkard does. Pinkard's the only one. Fuss and Dobbins, kind of surprising. So Fuss and Dobbins use the terms master and slave, which I think are these are terms imported to Hegel, because Hegel, Herr, which in German means lord or master, Herr, that can work for master, as I think that's the obvious translation. But the term that Hegel uses for servant, Knecht, is definitely not Sklave. So Sklave would be the term that if he wanted to say slave, he would have said slave. So German has a perfectly good word for slave, he would have used it. So that's I think one problem with the Fuss-Dobbins translation. And this is obviously a very famous part of the Phenomenology. So it's a thing to look out for and to pay attention to. Let's look at the end of the book now, the section on absolute knowing, where Hegel talks about how things culminate. And for him, the culmination is not total mastery, but the way that every form of mastery has a hiccup in it. And I want to focus on the line where he most clearly articulates that, and look at how the different translators deal with it. So this is a line about how absolute knowing is the knowledge of one's limit. So here's Pinkard. Knowing is acquainted not only with itself, but also with the negative of itself or its limit. To know its limit means to know that it is to sacrifice itself. Here's Inwood. Knowledge is aware not only of itself, but also of the negative of itself or its limit. To know one's limit is to know how to sacrifice oneself. There's a difference here between, and the German allows for both. So, seine Grenze wissen heißt, knowing one's limit means knowing to sacrifice oneself or how to sacrifice oneself. So wissen can mean to know how to do something or just to know to do it. And so Pinkard just says to know is to know to sacrifice itself. Whereas Inwood says is to know how to sacrifice oneself. Both seem acceptable to me, although there's a wide variance in that. And I think I lean more to the Inwood side again as getting closer to what Hegel might be going after in this section. Here's Fuss and Dobbins. Knowing not only knows itself, but also what's negatively complementary to it, that is, knows its limit. And to know its limit is tantamount to knowingly sacrificing itself. Okay, you see the liberal translation. So Hegel has a certain structure, he has certain word choice. So tantamount is in here. There's all kinds of things. So there's a negatively complementary to it. That doesn't seem justified by Hegel's text, but they're trying, and I'm not sure that that's more readable, but that's what they're striving for. They're striving for something that makes more sense to the English reader, and but I think that that's not, you can see that that's it doesn't quite get it. Here's Miller. The self-knowing spirit knows not only itself, but also the negative of itself or its limit. To know one's limit is to know how to sacrifice oneself. So this is in the line of Inwood more than Pinkard. Here's Bailey, just to go through it. Knowledge is aware not only of itself, but also of the negative of itself or its limit. Knowing its limit means knowing how to sacrifice itself. So you can see the translators, other than Pinkard, have focused on knowing how to. That knowing is here knowing how to. Fuss and Dobbins are a little bit unclear. Like they say knowingly sacrificing itself. So they're more on the side of Pinkard, although it's, again, not exactly clear what's going on in their sentence. So I hope it's clear now that there are real differences in the translations. I do want to say one thing, that I think all of the translations do a good enough job of communicating what Hegel's up to, that I don't think that one will be misled no matter which of the five one chooses. So I don't think that there is just a clear bad choice. Translation is a thankless task, and it's way too hard. And anyone that does it, and especially a book of this breadth and magnitude and size, deserves our infinite appreciation and should it really be subject to any critique. So I do apologize for saying anything critical, because I do want to say that if we just had one of these achievements, that would be, in a sense, enough. So I don't think one can go astray. So if one finds a cheap translation of Hegel out there and doesn't have a lot of money, pick it up. That's better than nothing, and it'll suffice. There's not, even with Bailey, I think one's not going to be led astray. And actually, I think there's some points at which Bailey is better than anyone else. Like in this nice line from the preface, I think Bailey's the best. So it's not, I don't think, and even though there are limitations to obviously Bailey's choice of phenomenology of mind versus phenomenology of spirit, there's a problem with, I think, Pinkard's way of translating tearing with the negative. I think that doesn't really get the job done. I think it's a little bit, it's a little clunky to say lingering is the magical power that converts the negative into being. Lingering, I don't think, again, gets the job done. I think there's a problem with Fuss and Dobbins' use of master and slave, Miller's capitalization of things arbitrarily. So there's all, I think each translation has a certain problems attached to it. I think one way to choose a translation is which has the least problems attached to it. And that's why if I were just going into reading Hegel for the first time, or if I were teaching, which I do, if I were teaching Hegel at this point, I would probably go to the Inwood translation because I think it does the best job of minimizing these different deficits. I don't think it has I think there are certain things that Pinker does better, but I think on the whole, in terms of what's going to make Hegel most accessible without losing what he's actually saying at any point or at not very often, to me, Inwood does the best job of doing that. And I don't know Michael Inwood. He didn't pay me to make this. So it's not it is clearly a subjective view, but hopefully it's not a corrupted view.